In this video, I'll use Unity and Bolt Visual Scripting to set up a split item UI so that you can have precise control on how many items you'd like to grab in your inventory. Let's begin.
Shall we play a game?
This is actually part 9 of my complete inventory series, and in order to be able to complete this tutorial, you need to have first completed the previous tutorials in order. If this is the first video in the series that you're seeing, simply click the card in the top right to return to the start. If you're the type of person who prefers a written tutorial to a video format, I've posted a link on my Patreon page that will give you a step-by-step guide on how to complete each of these steps, which is free for everyone to use. If you enjoy these tutorials and would like to help support my channel, be sure to choose your level of support on my Patreon page while you're there. As I stated in the showcase video, if you want the system but don't really care about building it, as my way of saying thank you to my top supporters, I've made the project files downloadable. Not only is my complete inventory system included to these supporters, but my complete 2D player controller as well, which, by the way, includes a simple enemy AI. With that out of the way, let's get started with this build. For this section of the build, we're going to have to first set up a split item UI, and then we're going to have to create several macros as well as modify some existing ones. We're also going to need a sprite image that we can use for our UI, and if you're interested, I have created a custom sprite image called Tooltip, and you're welcome to use that for your build. In order to grab that, just navigate to my online tutorial blog, and under the Getting Starting section right here, you can actually download that sprite from this link right here. Just click this button and it should open it up. Just right click and save that image as Tooltip. Once we get that sprite downloaded, we can actually import that into our game by going to our inventory system and just put it right here under your sprites folder. It's called Tooltip, just right there. What we're gonna have to do first to this thing is just go to your sprite editor, and as you open that up, just set the left, the top, the right, and the bottom borders to 5 and hit apply on the top right. The next thing that we're going to need to do is set up a new canvas game object. So by right clicking and going to UI, just select canvas, and we're going to name that split UI canvas. And over here on the right, go ahead and set the sort order to 3 so that it comes up and it's in front of everything else. Under UI scale mode, make sure that you scale this with screen size, and I've set this to a 16:9 ratio, so 1920 by 1080. And then you're going to have to give that a flow machine. Just set it to embed, delete the start and update functions, you won't need those, and then add a variable to it called split UI, which is a boolean, and leave it unchecked to false. And of course, I forgot to mention that your split UI canvas needs to have the split UI tags. If you don't have that, just go to add tag, hit the plus sign, and type in split UI. Going back to your split UI canvas, you can now select it from the list. For the next part of this build, we're going to need to create the following game objects, and I'm going to show you the finished product first, and I'll tell you exactly how I made it. So I'm going to turn this on. You're going to see the final product there. Just right-click the split UI canvas and go to UI and create a new image, and I renamed that image panel. And right here, you see the following information on it. You need to make sure that the width and the height is 400, or adjust that to whatever you like. I find that's a good number. Also, we're going to make the source image on that our tooltip. So whenever you actually import that in, you should notice that sprite actually looks kind of pixelated. And the reason why is because it's set to simple, so it should look like that. So if you set that to slice, you can now resize it, and it makes those edges a lot more crisp. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to right-click our panel, and we're going to go to UI and create a slider game object, and it should appear right here in the list. And these are the dimensions that you need to have on that. It is a -50 on the Y, so I've moved that pretty close to the bottom here so that things can sit above it and below it. It has a width of 280 with a height of 36. One thing that you need to definitely set on this slider, if I can find it right here, you need to make sure that this little check mark, hold numbers, is checked, or else this slider is not going to work at all for us. Okay, we're also going to give that slider a flow macro, so you can just add a component and add a flow machine, and it's actually going to be an embedded flow macro, and you can delete the start and update functions. We're not going to need either one of those for the slider game object. Going down in your slider list, we're going to right click and then we are going to create a UI text mesh pro, and that is actually going to be the first thing that's sitting underneath that. And that text object I just called one, and you might have to move yours around a little bit. That is actually this game object right here. This is going to reflect the number of items that we are actually moving on our slider here. So I've set the X position to, let me move that a little bit down. Let's set it to, I guess, 46 or 45, somewhere in there. 60, 45 should be around the right amount. You can actually set the width, I think, to like 50. And then, of course, I'm going to have to move that game object now. It is aligned on the right here. I also have the Jungle Adventure font asset that we've used before. And you can actually set the right alignment right here and the middle alignment right here. And that should be set up and ready to go. I don't know if I mentioned this, you need to make sure that that text object is right underneath that slider. So it's childed underneath the slider. We're also going to right click and we're going to create a UI image. And that image itself is going to be a width of 150 with a height of 150 as well. And you can play around with these values and just get it to set exactly where you want it to be. This image is actually going to copy the image of the items that we pick up. And so, you can set that exactly where you'd like it on the Y. I think I had mine set to 155. That seemed to work pretty well for me. Leave the source image to none here. We're actually going to change that with code. The image, of course, needs to be the second childed object, and it's very important that the text is first and the image is second, because we're actually going to set that up in our code to reference these game objects. On your image, you are actually going to right-click that, and you're going to create a UI Text Mesh Pro text object, and you can't actually see it right now. Let me see if I can turn this image off. You can actually see that that text that I have right there, and what this is going to do is it's not only going to throw the image up in the middle of our screen, so if we pick up one of these potions, it should show us a potion, but it should also show us exactly how many potions we are splitting here. So that's what this Text Mesh Pro unit is actually doing. This text game object here, I have the X set to 28, the Y set to a -30. The width and height, they're both 60. You can move these around. Just get it to where you're happy with it. The text itself is X2, so it's only going to come up when there's 2 or more. So I just started with X2. I have it as a Jungle Adventure font asset. Once again, the font size is 36. It is centered, and it is so it's centered horizontally, and it's centered vertically as well. As you click on the background game object underneath your slider, you can actually change the color of your slider to pretty much whatever you want. I just kind of left mine as blue. That seems to work well for me. So I'm just going to kind of leave that as a blue color. And the rest of those game objects you won't have to worry about. We now need to set up 2 buttons, one OK and one cancel. And the good news is this is relatively easy to do after we set the first button up. So clicking on the panel here, just go to UI and Button Text Mesh Pro, and you should see a button come up. And what I have set up on mine is, again, you can move these wherever you like. I just kind of have them set down on the bottom right and the bottom left. So you can actually set the X to, let's say, set that to 100, and the Y to a -125. The width and the height, so the width is 150, the height is 60, and I have just the regular UI sprite image that it actually comes with. I've just set the color to a green, like a darker green. The image type is sliced, of course, on that. This one is going to have a flow machine on it, and I will show you the flow macro in just a minute, but go ahead and set that to embed. And as you get to the Text Mesh Pro unit right here, these are the parameters that I have on that. I have the top at 5, the bottom at a -5. The text itself just says OK. I have the color set to white. It's a Jungle Adventure font. You can use whatever font you like. Just set that up with the Text Mesh Pro font asset creator, and then you can import that in. So my button says OK. The font size is 40. And now this is pretty well set up. And all I do to create the cancel button is I just right click and I duplicated this game object and I just named it cancel, and then I went in there and changed the color to red, and then clicking on the text game object, I just typed in cancel. And so now both of those buttons are set up, but again, both of these buttons need to make sure that you have an embedded flow machine on them both. Okay, the last thing that I have set up here is just a stationary text that says split amount. You can make it say whatever you want, but just clicking on my panel one more time and going to UI, text mesh pro, I have moved this game object down and over a little bit, just trying to make sure that I got these two things centered. Again, you might have to go into your slider text here and move that around, move both of those text game objects around. My text, I just said split amount. I have it set at a 280 width with a 50 height, and again, these X and Y might be different for you. Jungle Adventure text font asset that I have set up there, font size is 50, and that is pretty much the way that we set up our inventory UI. I'm going to go ahead and turn this image right back on because none of this is going to be visible unless we call it with our function. Okay, let's now move to our slider game object and let's work on the flow macro that we have embedded on this game object. This is essentially what we're going to need here. We are setting up a custom event, and I'll show you where that is triggered in just a few minutes. But we're going to set this up, and it's going to set the min value for the slider to 1. So the slider starts at 0, so we're actually setting that to 1 to ensure that whenever we right-click a game object or shift right-click a game object, we'll set that up in a minute, we're setting the minimum value to 1. And the maximum value is actually going to be set to the number of items in the list that we're going to be calling. So what we're doing here is we're setting the sprite image to that game object, the number 1 object in that list, and then we are going to set the text on the child game object. I believe the child of child here, so this is number 1. Remember, I told you it was very important that we make sure that we have these two images. Text is number 1 and image is number 2. So what we're doing here is we're setting the text on the child 0 right here, so that the text is being updated to read X plus the number of whatever items that we have in the list. The sprite is going to be set on this game object right here, which is why we have that get child right here actually serving that function. And on the bottom part of this macro, we are setting the update slider to reflect the text on its child, which is that text right there, as you can see. So what this is doing, essentially, when we move the slider, however many items that we have, and again, we set that slider to a whole number, it will reflect, this number right here will reflect exactly how many game objects we should be splitting. So if we have 3 and we're at 1, when we move up on the slider, it should say 2, and then as we get to the end here, it should say 3. The next thing we need to do is set up a flow macro that allows us to shift right-click on a game object. And in order to do that, just go to your macros folder under 5 other folder. You're going to right-click, create a new bolt flow machine, and name it shift right-click. And this is actually what that macro looks like. On the pointer click, we are checking to see if the right button is being pressed, as well as the left shift, and you can set that button to whatever you want, but I have mine set to left shift. And when both of those parameters come back as true, then we will get a true update out of the output. The next thing we need to set up is a way to open the UI whenever we shift right click. And the way we're going to do that is going under a macros folder under the 3-inventory item. We are going to grab the split UI, a split item UI. You don't have that, of course. You're going to have to create that flow macro, and this is what we're going to be setting up. This looks like a lot, but it's really not that bad. I will zoom in on this and walk you through this a little bit at a time here. So first thing it's going to do is check and see if our split UI is open. When we shift right click, if it's already open, we don't want to do anything. So we're checking that split UI parameter that we set up on our split UI game object that we've tagged to split UI. And if it comes back as false, then we can move to the next section here. Check and see if an item is in our hand. We don't want to do anything if an item's already in our hand. That can actually break the system. So we're going to set that in there and make sure that we can't do anything. unless nothing is picked up. Then we're going to count the number of items in our slot list, and if it is greater than 1, then what we're going to do is we're going to open our split UI by first setting the variable object variable split UI on that split UI game object that we're finding with tag to true. And then we're going to open the panel, and the way that we open the panel is just set the game object active for the child of the split UI game object that we find with tag. So that's actually going to turn our panel on. The last thing that we're going to do here is we're going to update the split UI by actually sending in the slot list on the game object that we're right-clicking here, and then we're going to get the child of the split UI and set the slider custom event trigger that we set up just a second ago in that slider macro, and then we're going to set the tag for this game object to split item. So as we look at this game object, for example, so this item game object, the tag is set to item, but we need to be able to reference back to that, so we're just setting up a little trick there in that we are splitting the item UI and setting the tag to that game object to split item, and when we're all done, we will actually reset it back. We can now actually set these two super units that we just created, the shift right click and the split item UI, into our item game object. So any item game object, just click that, it should open the item inventory flow macro. Just set that unit, shift right click here, and just run the flow into the split item UI. We also need to add a little change to our add to stack super unit. When you open that up, we need to add this little unit right here to ensure that shift is not being pressed down when we right click, because we want something else to happen when shift is not being pressed down. So just move the input over and add these two units, the branch and the input get key left shift, and run the false into the item picked up branch. And we also have to make a little change to the relocate item super unit. You should have this input sitting right down here with the flow running into this branch. Just break that flow by right clicking and scoot it up a little bit and run it into this grouping right here. What this is doing is it's checking to see if our split UI panel is actually open. If our split UI panel was actually open, then we would be able to still click on our game objects if we didn't have this. And that can actually break our system. We don't want to do that. So we're going to run that out into a false variable here, out of a false variable from the flow, and run it into this branch right here. And we're also going to set up this custom event called get all. This is actually taken care of whenever our slider is all the way over and we're trying to grab all of the items. As it comes back into the system, we're going to set the tag on this game object back to item and just reset it. Okay, let's actually take a look at our cancel button flow macro that we have set up. This should be an embedded flow macro in our flow machine here. This one is relatively simple because all we're doing here is whenever we click on the cancel button, we're just setting the split UI object variable on our split UI game object that we're finding with tag there to false to say essentially, hey, it's closed. So that's the way we check whether it's open or closed. And then we are going to set the tag on that thing that says split item. Remember, we right click and shift and it sets that item game object to split item. We're just changing that back to item, and then we are closing the panel by setting the active or setting the game object active to false on the get parent of that object. So essentially what we're doing is we're canceling and we're saying set the panel to deactivate it. That's how that button is actually working. The OK button is actually a little bit more difficult to set up, and the way that we're actually going to start setting this up is we need a new scene variable. We're going to add a scene variable, call it split amount. This is going to be an integer, and just set it to 0. And the reason why is because we need that number, whatever we try to split, to carry into a couple of places so that that can reflect correctly. Okay, we're now ready to take a look at the OK button embedded macro that we have set up on this, and this is kind of a longer one, but it's not that bad. As you understand what's going on here, I meant to mention on the cancel button that we are actually using an on pointer down on the cancel button and the OK button, and the reason why is because I've found with this system that the guys who play tested this for me very generously, they found that if you grab this button and you drug off of it, you could actually break the split amount and you could split until infinity, and we don't want to do that. So what we're doing there to compensate for that is, instead of using an on button event or an on button down, we're using an on pointer down, so that as soon as this object is clicked on, it will trigger this event. And so what we want to do is we want to set the split amount for the scene variable that we set up as an integer to whatever the value is, the slider value of the child of the parent object. You're going to say, why are we getting the child of the parent? Well, it's because we're actually grabbing the first child of the parent, and this is the second child here. So we're getting the parent, we're getting the child, the first child of that. That is actually that slider game object, and we're setting the split amount to whatever the slider is currently setting on, because you can't be dragging the button and press the OK button with your mouse at the same time. So it has to be sitting somewhere. And so we are now grabbing, we're doing a little check here to see if we're grabbing all of the items. And the way we're doing that is we're running the split amount, what it's currently at on the slider, and we're seeing if that is equal to the number of all the items in our slot list on the split item game object that we find with that tag. If it is, then we are going to simply get all the game objects by triggering the custom event that we set up on that game object on our item called get all, and we find that split item with tag once more, and we trigger this event. If we're not trying to get all of the objects, then we're actually going to trigger a new custom event we're about to set up on our item and our object manager called split item. And of course, this one is being triggered on the object manager, and this one is being triggered on the item that we are actually splitting, and temporarily set that tag to split item. Both of these units will then run into this setting object variable split UI to false on the object that we find with the tag split UI, so that split UI game object variable that we set up, and then we are simply closing the panel. So when we click the OK button, that is what this OK button is actually going to be doing. Now let's take a look at our other game object. In our macros object manager folder that we had already established, we are going to set up a new flow macro called split item. So just right click and create a new bolt flow macro, call it split item. And this is what this macro needs to look like. Not a whole lot going on here. We're simply running the split amount into our last node here on the for loop, so that we're actually going to stop on whatever the split amount was, and then we're going to be adding all of the items up to that split amount into the pick slot list from the slot list that is temporarily tagged split item. As it exits, we set the object picked variable on our object manager to true, and then we run that into an output. So when we click on our object manager game object, I'll show you exactly where we set that. This is kind of a bigger macro, but we set those two game objects right here. We need a custom event called split item that will trigger on itself, and it runs into split item super unit that we just created that looks like that, and we're running that into this branch right here. You're actually going to need one more little check on every game item. So if you just kind of click on one in your hierarchy here and open up the item flow macro, you're going to need to add the split UI check on that game object that we find with tag split UI, and just run the on mouse button down into the branch here and run a false into the is pointer over game object. This just ensures that if our split UI is open, we can't pick up items from the world. And we need to add those very same units to our add stack flow macro, which is actually under our stack manager. So when we put items in the world and it becomes a stack, whether it be single items or stack, we're going to ensure that if our split UI panel is open, then we cannot add any game objects to our inventory. Okay, we're almost done, I promise. Under the macros folder, under the inventory item folder, we're going to create a new flow macro called update split, and this is what this is actually going to look like, and I'll show you exactly where we place this on our game object. So as we have an input coming in, we're doing a little bit of finesse here and gymnastics with Bolt visual scripting. We are actually going to take the split amount and run that into the first node here, because this is only being triggered when we're not trying to grab all of the items, so at least one item is going to be moved at this point. Then we are going to count the number of items in the slot list and run that into our last node for our for loop. Then we're going to give the remainder of whatever's left over from the split amount to the pick slot list 2 on our object manager. And then we are going to clear the slot list on the exit. When it's done doing all of that, pulling it from the slot list, we are going to clear the slot list. And then we're going to add the remainder of those items that we add to pick slot list 2 to our slot list, and then clear the pick slot list 2. And of course, the last thing that we have to do, because this is actually different from our get all custom event that we had, we are now going to set the tag back to item, and I'll show you exactly where we're going to set this on our game object. So as we click to item here, we're just going to set this right here at the top. Let me give you the full macro here. We're just setting that right here, doing a custom event called split item, and we're running that into our update split with the output going into our update stack on our add items. Okay, and the last thing that we need to do is we need to disable our panel for our split UI canvas. We need to disable that so that when we start up our game, that's not actually active. We only want that to be active whenever we shift right click. Okay, you should now have the ability to hold shift and right click and split the amount of game objects that you'd like in each stack. I failed to mention that in our code, when you hold shift and right click on a single item, the split UI utility does not come up. It's only whenever we're trying to split multiple items, so that is actually pretty cool. Whenever you grab all of the items, you should see that reflect as well. And this is awesome, but what if we want the ability to be able to right click and consume consumable items? Well, that's what we're going to cover in our next tutorial. I hope this video was helpful for you and that you now have complete control over how many items you want to grab from your inventory. I'm looking forward to the next tutorial, but for now, just let me say thanks for joining me. My name is Megahertz, and I'm out.